Here in Germany, there's a saying, life writes the best stories, which is true, but sometimes not. Because some people tell stories that, maybe exceed what's possible in real life, or create characters that are too good to be true, or forge whole fantasy worlds. But what if you are such a creative person and you want to make a living out of it? Ideally in the gaming industry or filming industry. Our next speaker, she's already here, is such a AAA narrative designer and games writer, of course. She currently works for Sumo Digital in Nottingham. And in the next 45 minutes, she will tell you how to get into game narrative. Sarah Longthorne.
Hello. Thanks for having me here. As noted, my name is Sarah Longthorne, and I'm here to talk about getting into game narrative. So a little bit about me. I'm going to go into more of my story in a bit, but just the top line details. I'm the narrative designer at Sumo Digital, as again mentioned. I have written and designed and consulted on multiple games across most major platforms. A lot of those are still under NDA or not released yet, but that skipped past. Of the ones I can talk about, I've got Love Island, the mobile game, Cthulhu Chronicles, RuneScape, Block and Load, just to give you a rough idea of what I've done. Okay, so can I get a show of hands? Who here knows what a narrative designer does? Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And who here knows the difference between a narrative designer and a games writer? Is that no one? Or Great. Okay, that gives me something to talk about. So, just a heads up, there is a difference, but some studios will treat games writers and narrative designers as the same thing. For me, that's always been the case. I do both. So I'm going to go through all the different sort of roles, the different responsibilities at least, and then at the end I'll sort of say what the differences are. Okay, so the first thing is coming up with a premise that contextualizes gameplay. So if you're brought in at the start of a project, you'll get the game designers coming up and saying, hey, I want to make a game where you can shoot guns, but you can also, shoot arrows, and you can do some parkour, some zip lining, and there are like lots of human enemies and animals, but also like a little bit of supernatural. And I'm like, okay, so we're making Tomb Raider. And that's the kind of the sort of responsibility there, is coming up with a character who would do all of these things and make it logical that they would do them. So the next thing is determining how the player experiences the narrative. So with a very narrative-driven game, that's all sort of mandatory. You've got a lot of cutscenes, and that's fine because that's what the player expects. But for some games, the player isn't necessarily playing for the narrative. So you might want to do things differently. You might want to make those cutscenes optional, or you might want to forego cutscenes altogether and go for things like environmental storytelling, lore books, things like that. So the next thing, again, designing and documenting systems for communicating interactive elements. So the best way to talk about this is probably through examples. So when we were writing the Love Island mobile game, we were making this dating sim where you can date more than 13 different people at different points in the narrative. And we wanted lots of variability. But also, this might sound like a lot of writers, but we had 8 writers by the end of the project. And that wasn't really enough. So we wanted to minimize the amount of words that we were writing while still having a lot of variability. And so we needed to design systems which would allow us to branch the narrative as much as possible, but without, writing a billion words. And in the end, we got it down to 700,000 for season 2. So, each of us basically wrote a novel in 8 months. The next thing, so this is more of interest if you're interested in the writing side. So ideation and documentation of world story and characters. This is the brainstorming phase, the part where you're also like making these character bibles, these world bibles. And then part of that as well, breaking the story. So this is a screenwriting term if you haven't heard it before. It's about figuring out what happens over the course of the season, and then in the course of an episode, and then in a scene, or in game writing terms, over the course of a quest, or like a quest line and then a quest, and then a scene within that quest, things like that. And then, of course, the actual writing part, So depending on what kind of studio you're working at and how much they value narrative and how central that narrative is, you might just be doing the writing and then they're like, cool, we'll ship that. And you're like, I haven't edited it yet, which is terrifying. But ideally, you're also going to be revising and editing. And if you're a narrative designer purely, then you're going to be doing like the first 3 of those things and then maybe the last ones as well. And if you're just purely a games writer, then you're going to be doing the last one and maybe the last 3. Who knows? Okay, so a little bit more about my story getting into this. So I started off with a degree. I didn't realize how relevant it would be at the time. And then after that, I was like, well, it's not realistic to get a creative writing job. So, I'm not going to get paid for that. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll try to do 3 different things. And eventually I ended up in marketing. And I was in this company that I wasn't happy at. And one of my colleagues said, well, why don't you work in a games company then? Do the same thing at a game studio. And I was like, I could do that. So Jagex was in the same city, and you might know it for RuneScape, for example. So I applied there, and the role wasn't anything that I could do at the time. It was all building HTML templates. And I thought, well, maybe if I can get that job, then I can become a copywriter, because that's writing, right? So I didn't know HTML, but I took 2 days off work and learned how to do HTML. And that enabled me to get the job. And when I got there, I was looking around like, people are writing these games. That's a paid job. And so I started asking the narrative designers for opportunities and saying, hey, if there's writing to be done, can I do some? And they said, yeah. So I started, accidentally. I didn't even realize I was getting credits at this point. But by the end of my time at Jagex, I already had 2 credits. And I was also getting experience in design and things. We had in-house game design competitions, we had in-house game jams, and so I got to actually take on that role of a narrative designer or a writer or a game designer through those things without actually having the formal role. And then conferences like this one, making friends with people. I've skipped over the founder mentor part because I actually did that through social media, which is in the next point. I'd already started building my portfolio from the work I'd done at Jagex, but then I was like, well, I need to prove that I can write other stuff, more than bark lines and these linear scripts. So I started writing spec scripts, writing my own scripts and including them in my portfolio. And then, eventually I went into freelance. I was like, well, you know what, I can skip the copywriting part. I'm just going to give this a shot. And I did. And I have to be transparent about this. I wouldn't have been able to survive the months that I was freelancing without the help of my mentor. So it is so important, if you can, to get a mentor. And Twitter's great for that, because that's how I met mine. Okay, so, my background is obviously uni and marketing, but there are lots of different backgrounds that you can come from. So I spoke to a few people on Twitter and I said, hey, what kind of background have you had? And we got all of these. So we came back with translation, theatre, film and TV, game design, QA, marketing, publishing, journalism, just straight out of university for a few people. But the main important thing here is that you don't have to have one particular background. It depends really on what you're doing right now. None of these backgrounds are wrong. None of these will stop you getting it. They might delay it slightly because they're slightly more indirect. But what really matters is what you're doing right now to prepare for the job. So another thing I asked Twitter was, hey, hiring managers, what do you actually look for? What makes you hire a candidate? And the most important thing that came back here is that an application is about convincing a hiring manager that they can trust you with their baby, their game that they care so much about and which they have a very limited budget for, and they want to do, as quickly and as well as possible with as few iterations as possible, that you can do that and you won't, cause any problems, you won't cost them money. And the best way, unfortunately, to do that is by having credits on a relevant title, because that's an easy way to say, hey, I've done this before. I guess the main thing here is that people learn by making mistakes and being like, well, I shouldn't do that again. And a hiring manager wants to know that you've already done that before, so you won't be making those mistakes this time, that you've already learned from them, and you're not going to be doing things which are going to cost them money. But you don't have to have that experience on a relevant title. I mean, it helps a lot, but if you can take the initiative, if you can write spec scripts, for example, so like find a game or a film that you really love, or like a TV show, and write a script for that and say, hey, I can do this, I just haven't been published for it. If you can show you have the experience that someone who's been in a game studio already has, then there's not that much differentiating you. And then, this is kind of like building from that. So the things you want to show that you have experience in. So game narrative, of course, like you want to be able to convince the hiring manager that you understand what makes a great story. And things like I was mentioning earlier about understanding what kind of approach to narrative suits what kind of games, things like that you want to be understanding and showing that you understand. The same with design. Narrative design, if you are doing that specifically, is very design oriented. Like the project I'm working on at the moment, which I can't talk too much about, is pretty much all design for me. I'm doing very little writing. So you really need to show that you understand that, and you want to be able to talk to your hiring manager at the interview and say, hey, I've identified this game that does this really well, or this game was bad because of this, and that will help them understand that you understand. And the last thing, this might seem like irrelevant, but it's really not. If you have experience with planning, budgeting, workflows, milestones, processes, things like that, you don't even have to have direct experience, but if you can show again that you understand, that helps so much, because they need to know that you can work within those frames. Okay, so these next ones are going to be sort of soft skills, sort of personality qualities that really help. So the first is the flexibility to change direction in response to feedback. So just to give an example, actually my example is for a later point, so we're going to save that. But ideally you're going to have a lot of feedback. You're going to have people saying, actually this isn't working, and that's great. That's exactly what you want, because the first script, the first draft that you've done often isn't perfect. And the way to make it perfect is by having other people tell you where it could be improved, and that's fantastic. And the best thing you want to be able to do is say, okay, I can adapt to that. I'm not going to sort of dig my heels in and say, well, no, I've already done all this work, because that's not how game dev works. So very similar to that, the humility to do that. So it takes flexibility, but it also takes humility to say, okay, I don't know everything. The more you think you know, the more you have left to learn. And that includes taking advice from sometimes less senior people. If an idiot says 2 + 2 is 4, that doesn't make it wrong. But if a very intelligent person says 5 + 5 is 50, then you're like, you're still intelligent, but that was wrong. So sometimes people with less experience can say something really interesting, or have a very, unique take that maybe you hadn't considered. So you need to have humility to listen to those people. Again, this is very interconnected, but camaraderie, again, listening to others, collaborating, embracing their ideas. So we had a game jam recently, and the best ideas came from the producer. It's not necessarily her role to be, influencing design and narrative in her usual job, but she came up with fantastic ideas. And you need to be able to listen to people who aren't necessarily in your discipline. Good problem-solving skills. So this is where I wanted to use that example. I worked on a game where I was advised, I came in quite late, and the first thing I said was, the approach for this game, like the approach to narrative for this game, is wrong. This isn't going to work. This is going to really annoy players. And they said, no. We are far too late into the development cycle to be making changes like that. And I was like, well, fine, okay, I'll try my best to make this as, unannoying as possible. And then after I'd come off the project, I'd done all my work, they were like, she was right. So then I had to come back onto the project and write it all over again. And you can't afford to just be like, well, no, you have to do it if you want the game to be good and if you want that credit to reflect on you well. This is slightly different. So passions and interests outside of games and considered opinions. Hiring managers love to see that you have this because it can influence your work in so many ways. The more knowledge you have to draw from, the more experiences you have to draw from, the better your game is going to be because you have all these different things to feed into it. And diversity is part of that as well. So coming off what Kim was saying, having lots of people from diverse backgrounds who have different experiences, like they will be able to feed in something that, someone from a different background like may not be exposed to. And so you've got lots of different things feeding in. Okay, and yeah, the next two are pretty much what I expect from any colleague. Organizational skills, time management skills, communication, professionalism, friendliness, punctuality. I don't need to explain those. And the last thing is confidence. A lot of managers, or just people in general, mistake confidence for competence. If you can come across and say, hey, my name is Sarah, they'll be like, she's good, but I haven't proven anything at all. Whereas someone who's really, really skilled might come in and just be like, oh, I can do this. And, it's difficult because a lot of hiring managers will assume they don't know their stuff, but they do. And so it's really important to represent yourself well, even if it's not necessarily how you usually are. I'm a massive introvert, and this is really intimidating, but I hope you didn't necessarily notice that. Okay, so the last part of this, what hiring managers want, a well-organized and succinct, a well-organized CV and a succinct, well-written, typo-free cover letter. Don't fall at the first hurdle, guys. You're meant to be writers. Don't put typos in your cover letter, please. And so, coming on to the portfolio, what you really want to do is you don't want to have a portfolio that you send to everyone because it won't be relevant. And hiring managers value their time. They're going through a lot of different applicants. So the more you waste their time, the more annoyed they're going to be and they're going to skip over your application. So you want to take time to sort of look at the studio and the games that they make and think, okay, what do I have sample-wise that's relevant here? And you want to select those and make a little bespoke mini portfolio to send to them. And ideally, you want to guide them through it. So you want to have a little sort of paragraph above each one to say, what this is, why it's relevant, what they should be looking for, what were you trying to achieve in this sample. So again, with your samples, this came up a lot. Naturalistic dialogue. So a lot of people who apply for writing roles will submit this very high fantasy thing, and I love fantasy as much as the next person, but if everyone's talking like, oh, Doff the dragon sort of thing, then, that's not, what happens in the majority of games, and they want to know that you can write normally. Emotional. Things that capture our emotions and make us feel something are much more memorable. And that's what you want to be. You want to be memorable. You want to stand out. It doesn't necessarily have to be like the most dramatic thing ever, like everyone dying. But if you can write something that moves someone and that's your sample, then that's amazing. And you're much more likely to get noticed. Again, a simple one. If you're sort of experimenting with genre, you want to show that you understand the genre, show that you know how it affects the narrative. And then the last thing that came up a couple of times, bark lines. Who here knows what a bark line is? Okay, one person, that's great. So a bark line is a line in a script which it's not in a script, essentially. So, when you're playing like a fighting game and someone says like ammo or health pack or something, a writer on a game like that will often have to write like 50 different ways to say there's a health pack. And you get it in a lot of games, so it's useful to show that you know how to do that and that you can say there's a health pack in 50 different ways. But it doesn't really tell the hiring manager much except that you can do it. So, maybe have like one example, but you don't go too wild on it. The next two things are, they're not necessary, but hiring managers have spoken to me and said that they would like to see it. In design, for narrative design, you're going to be creating a lot of documentation. It's design, so they want to see how you've done that. They want to see the documentation that you produced, if you can show it. And another thing someone else said was that, especially if you're in a narrative-heavy game, editing matters so much. And so you want to show things that you've edited that other people have written that have been published. If you have done that, and you can say, by the way, I edited these things, that's going to show that you have the skills to do that part of the job. Okay, so we're making good time. What can you do now to prepare for this sort of job? What can you do to make yourself really hireable? Do your research is the first thing. We talked earlier about not necessarily having the credits, having the experience, but through research, you can make up for a lot of what you're losing there. If you can watch, if you can watch a GDC talk, a retrospective, for example, about the mistakes game designers made, then you don't have to make those mistakes yourself. You can just learn from them and be like, okay, I already understand that. I don't need to make that mistake. But also from playing games, you can just be like, okay, well, I didn't like the thing they did there and I would have done it differently. Furnish your mind with as much knowledge as you possibly can. Teach yourself new skills. So we hear a lot about being a T-shaped person. Does anyone here know what that means? Okay, cool, I can say it. So a T-shaped person is basically the idea, the upwards part of the T is having depth of knowledge in the thing that you're good at. Being very, very good, being masterful of the thing that you do. But, the bit across the top is the idea that you also understand other disciplines and how they work with your discipline. So a lot of this, again, comes from experience, from having worked with other teams. But, having had the experience of being like, okay, I want to make this, I want to make this scene, and then animation comes back to you and says, this is way too much work. If you can anticipate that sort of stuff, then that's kind of what it means to be a T-shaped person. But also just having other skills as well. So some narrative design jobs want you to implement your script as well. So it's useful to have things like Python, C++, C#. Code is great because it basically makes you more hireable. It gives you extra skills that they might be looking for. And that will give you a little bit of a boost. And it also helps you just to understand logic, which is necessary for branching narratives. You need to have some understanding of logic. There's that portfolio that we talked about. If you don't have game samples that you can show from published titles, then you really want to be either making your own games with things like Twine and Inky, or you want to be creating your own little bits of script, maybe a whole script, maybe part of it. If you don't have it, then make it. Take the initiative. Next thing is a website. So, LinkedIn is, but it's good to update it. My last job came through LinkedIn. That's how they approached me. So, but if you have a website, that can be your one-stop shop for everything about you to sell yourself the way you want to sell yourself. And so I really recommend doing that if you can. Meetups and conferences. Hey, like this one. Approaching the speakers afterwards and talking to them. If you have questions, just ask. I think that's probably the main takeaway from this talk is asking for things, not being afraid to go after what you want. But also, so these sort of points are all interconnected. It's about making connections and not necessarily so you can be like, okay, I know this person and now I can get a job with them. That's great. No, it's not about that. You don't want to make friends for what you can, get from people. You want to do it because people have really interesting stories and they're interesting people and they're great. And you can have support from them. They can tell you about their experiences. You can tell them about yours. And it's so important to have that sort of support network of people who understand what you do. And yeah, Twitter's great for that, by the way, but also awful. Seek out mentorship. So sometimes individuals offer this, and you can usually find out about that through Twitter. So I think this is still open, but my mentor, Greg Buchanan, is taking mentees at the moment for games writing. So look him up on Twitter if you're interested in that. Also, sometimes studios offer it, and they offer, schemes and things. But there are a few places that are kind of geared more towards this. So Limit Break is specifically, I think, for women. And so that's a really good mentorship scheme there. And also BAFTA Crew, so that takes people, I think, once a year. And it offers a lot of different networking opportunities, but also workshops and things. So it's definitely worth looking into. And the last thing, what I did, if you already work at a studio, ask for opportunities to do the thing that you want to do. And again, that's the main takeaway. If you don't have something, do it yourself. And, you know, if the opportunity is there, just ask for it. Take what you want. Don't wait for someone to give you permission. And that's it. Are there any questions? Hi.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. One question. Could you explain one more time the difference between game writer and narrative designer? I still don't get it.
Sure, that's sorry about that. Yeah, so a games writer usually just does the writing part. It's literally just writing, sometimes coming up with the story, but that's pretty much it. Someone who's purely doing narrative design will do the design aspects. So they're looking at the ways to communicate narrative. They're looking at the logistics behind it and the approach to it. So, saying this kind of game needs cutscenes and this kind of game needs environmental storytelling, and saying, okay, well, if we're going to be using a branching narrative in this game, then how are we going to approach it? How are we going to work with the sort of logical aspect of branching narrative to deliver exactly what we want? Is that a little bit better?
Yes,
okay.
Thanks.
Cool, thanks.
Sorry, just a small thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe turn back the one slide? I'd like to make a photo from it. Thank you.
That's fine, no worries.
Thank you very much for your speech. It's
Yay.
very good.
Thank you.
So you mentioned in one of your things like asking for mentors or finding a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
How did you approach it, and what's your experience with that? Can you tell us a little more?
Yeah, sure. So I have to be honest here, mine came much easier to me than I think it usually would. So for me, I was working at Jagex and I followed Greg Buchanan on Twitter because one of my colleagues was like, hey, this guy's a really good games writer and he does a really good newsletter and you can learn a lot from him. So I followed him. And then he DM'd me, to my great and excited surprise, because he wanted a ticket to develop. And I was like, okay, well, I'll look into that for you. But while you're here, can I ask you some questions about game narrative? And I happened to catch him at that point where he was thinking about taking on mentees, but hadn't really done it before. So he contacted me a week later. And at that point, it was because I was the main person who had approached him about it. And so I was his go-to. And he said, well, you were looking for, you wanted to learn more about this. Like, would you like me to mentor you? And I was like, yeah. So it kind of happened a lot easier for me. And I can't deny that. And I can't be like, oh, I struggled so much to find it. But now he's doing it much in he's using more process for it. He's opening it up, maybe once or twice a year and making people apply for it. And I feel I am very privileged that I didn't have to apply. But yeah. Twitter's great, but also hell.
Hi. So these are a lot of things, right, to do. And isn't it a bit of like an overkill, actually? Because I think, like narrative stuff, it needs to be very flexible, like to the game, etc. And I know this from like other, jobs like UX designer, etc., that they have to create a portfolio for a specific thing, but then they want them to have what they need, and then how like the human aspect of it is kind of missing, right? And I don't know what's your stand on this, because if somebody's starting new and then they have to do all of these things, I think that's a bit too much.
Yeah, that's completely valid. I am very much known for overkill. So, I tend to, force myself to crunch a bit too much, and I know that's pretty awful. That's just my personality. So this talk is sort of assembled from talking to hiring managers and saying, okay, what are all the things you'd like to see? What do you think could help someone to grab your attention? And so it's kind of a collection of everything. And a lot of people who get into this won't have done all these things. Like, I've not made a game on my own before, but a lot of other people have. And so you don't have to do everything. But I would also say that, for everything you haven't done, there'll be someone else applying who has. But also, again, like you said, that's not everything. A lot of it is down to personality fit. And I do completely agree with that. This is more just like the concrete things. But yeah, very valid point. Thank you.
I have another thing. So we have like this games club at work. So one of them was Love Island. And I have no idea about like Love Ireland and British TV and something like this. So I learned the word banter, and I played it twice, and I even paid money for it. So good job on that.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first one is, so you mentioned that it's important to have dramatic scenes or show off that you can write dramatic scenes. I was wondering, how about comedy? Is that something that's also being asked for, or where hiring managers are looking for more often? Recently, in your experience?
I mean, definitely. There are a lot of games that are sort of focus on comedy. So, like Borderlands, for example, like you want to show strong comedic skills for a game like that. I guess I maybe used the wrong word when I said dramatic. It needs to be emotional. And one emotion is, finding something really funny. You need to elicit an emotion. You need to get people laughing or feeling sad or feeling angry. Hopefully not by being awful. But it's more about getting them to feel something.
Thank you. And I had a second question, but I forgot right now, so I'll just give back the mic and maybe I'll remember.
Sure, yeah, feel free to approach me afterwards. Anyone else?
Hi. What exactly did your mentor do with you that you like? How did he mentor you?
So mentorship, it'll change from person to person, of course, and depending on who's mentoring them. For me, it was if I needed advice on something, then I would talk to him and he would give me that advice. I sent him my portfolio and my samples and my website, and he gave me feedback on all of those. He also helped me a lot with finding work, both in terms of if he found out about an opportunity or if he was approached with something and he didn't have capacity, then he would say, hey, Sarah, go for this. And it was very much on, pointing me in the right direction. But also extremely usefully, he also hired me a few times himself. So again, it'll be different from each person, and the person mentoring you won't always have capacity, especially for the last part. But yeah, that basically got me through my freelance work. Real good? Hi.
Hi. I also have a question. I think it's amazing how you could flourish in your work and totally, like, how should I say, bloom. Well, I can see that in the presentation that you have a lot of fun. But let's rewind a little bit. How do I score a job like that? But of course, I mean, like, without the obvious stuff, like preparing your portfolio perfectly and go to events and talk to people. What else is there?
Applying, mainly. Applying for things, meeting people. So much of this industry is who you know, which is very unfortunate, but you kind of have to play the game at this point because that's how it is. And I feel horrible for saying that, but yeah, make friends, speak to speakers. You can speak to me afterwards. Hi. Yeah, I think Twitter is, again, I keep saying it's awful and good at the same time, and that's primarily because a lot of A lot of hiring managers will post job opportunities on there, but I'd say also if you see an opportunity and you know who you know someone on the team, or you've seen someone on the team, especially the hiring manager on Twitter, it's worth reaching out, as long as you're not being annoying or anything. Just saying like, hi, could you tell me more about this opportunity? Could you tell me a bit more about what you're looking for? And sometimes, often they'll be quite obliging, and that can kind of help you if you start making a personal connection with them on top of that. On top of your normal application, but a lot of it is applying for things and knowing the right people.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.